So every time I think about the concept of grace, I can't help but have Billy on my mind. Billy was a young man, about 24, 25 years old at the time I knew him, when I was interning at my first church during seminary in Chicago. And Billy was almost there every time the door was open to the church. And I served 3 years there and can't remember many times where we didn't have him in the room. And it was just such a blessing to have him there. One of the interesting reasons why he was a blessing is he broke our minds of how God works in really meaningful ways. You see, Billy was a person who was severely mentally disabled. And he would show up to worship basically in arm or hand in hand with his mother and his father. Again, he lived with them because he wasn't able to live on his own. And they would come flanking him and come to receive all of the worship that largely Billy had no idea what was going on. He couldn't cognitively understand. But this church, much like this church, has had a great music ministry, and it had a wonderful diversity of things that they would offer, whether it be traditional hymns, or you had rock and gospel music, or a little bit of jazz, or a little bit of Christian contemporary. There was no box of worship that they weren't going to break. And every single time, Billy was just completely present to the music, and he found himself bopping to whatever beat was there as if it was already in his bones. So one day after worship, the parents came to us with Billy present, of course, with them, and they said, "Can we talk to y'all for a moment?" My mentor pastor and I. And they said, we know that baptism is a thing that usually people choose and they know what's going on. Wait for this. But Billy, we thought we'd get him baptized at some point, and we just never did. It never happened. And here he is, an adult. What do we do about that? Even if he can't understand what's going on, is that something that would be available to him? And Trey and I looked at each other and smiled and said, well, of course he would be. And so next Sunday, as we talked with the family, we put Billy right at the very top of worship, because what better way to begin worship than to remember who we are in God's Spirit. And we called Billy up, and of course he was kind of looking around a little bit nervous, because he's never the center of attention, was always the wallflower on the side doing his thing. And then when he walked up to the baptismal, much like this one, an open bowl filled with water, and the whole congregation circled around him. That's how the seats were set, just waiting for this holy moment to begin. We said the same words of grace, the same words of promise, the same words of commitment over Billy's life. And even though he couldn't say the words yes, or I will, or confess his faith in Jesus in a way that would speak in ways that we can understand of his transformation, Billy showed up. He showed up to what God was doing in whatever way he could. And so after all of that happened and he found himself ready and his parents held on to his hands a little bit tighter, we not only sprinkled water over him and put the sign of the cross, but we just poured it, because we wanted to make sure he could feel and understand kind of the cleansing nature of what was going on there, that it would feel different, like it's a different day. And he found himself just drenched with the water all kind of dripping through his bangs, and he was looking down for a second, and we thought and wondered whether he was okay. But then he just looked up, and there was like a Cheshire cat smile that was from ear to ear that you could never wipe away. His eyes were gleaming, and he just went like this. And there is no better reminder of what grace is to me than that. His eyes were hungry for it, and he showed every single person in the room that day that still holds it even in their memory, that grace comes by showing up, by opening your heart, your very self, and emptying yourself, being receptive to what God might offer you, rather than instead being sure or certain or being ready or deserving of God's gift or having the perfect words to say to profess how righteous you and I are. Billy wouldn't be denied the grace that was given and meant for him that day, turning toward God's gracious gift of new life with everything he had. Last week we talked about prevenient grace, which is a fancy word for saying the grace that opens and prepares the way. And this sense of grace in God really does prepare the way for these moments of justification, like you heard about from Billy. Justification meaning, in Wesley's words, just another word for pardon, a forgiveness of sins, our acceptance with God. It's being reconciled to God or realigned to God's purposes if perhaps we have strayed a little bit from the path a bit, if there is even a linear path at all. You can also think about it as a doorway. A doorway to the very house of God's saving, the accepting of our identity with God. And it is an identity that we can never earn, but we can also never have it taken away from us. Did you know that? Never. It's entering a whole new existence, even if it just feels like, after those moments, putting one foot in front of the other, living another everyday, ordinary life. It is turning toward a new future. And the door is wide open with a welcome sign on it, ready for you to go on the journey. I've said before, probably in this space, the whole concept of changed people change people. You've probably heard it before somewhere. Changed people change people. I don't know about you, but a lot of times when I think of change in people, I think about those transformative, life-changing moments that seem for a lot of other people really drastic, right? So like those times where perhaps you had an addiction or attachment that either paralyzed you in your life of faith or completely had you in another space where God's presence was not even a factor in your life and seemed very far away. Those drastic cases of folks are out there. In fact, they are probably even in this room in a way that you and I would never even detect. Who knows the life story and history of each person around us and the ways that God has brought us from the pit even to be present here today. I want you to actually look around at the people sitting beside you and behind you and before you. I mean, really, look. They're beautiful, aren't they? You know, there may be those stories of where we have been brought back from the farthest place. And there may be others of us that might find yourselves and myself oftentimes thinking, well, I'm nothing special. I don't have a really good story of how God has worked in me. I'm just here, living as an everyday, ordinary person, doing the best I can, tripping up sometimes, but not tripping up too bad. In a way, we all find ourselves on that spectrum, no matter where we show up in worship today in our very lives. But none of us are ever static. We don't stay in those places. It's a constant movement back and forth, up and down, around, over. Again, there is no line or one path. but multiple paths where we can find the door. So Lydia, Shelley spoke about Lydia so well to give kind of a priming of the pump there and got you thinking about her as a character. Whether it's right or wrong, maybe my seminary professor would say this is not the right thing to do. I don't care. We're here. And I always love to try to find the ways that characters can be human and, in fact, these real people living real lives in the wake of Jesus' time might connect with our own experience. And Lydia, as we know, had so much in life really going for her from cultural standards. She was rich. She was in a position of power that very few women could ever find in that kind of stage and place and generation of life. And yet, with all of the provision, with all of her family around her, with all of the abundance that she was able to enjoy, there was something in her, I would imagine, that was not quite content. None of us ever really go looking for something or find ourselves sitting in front of a stranger preaching odd things without having some posture of looking for something. And so, in Lydia's case, she also may not have been the kind of person who's ever really hit rock bottom or found themselves in a place where they have nowhere to turn but Jesus. In her case, there was something about life that was incomplete, maybe even something that she was silently lamenting even as she showed up in the world as if everything was okay. There wasn't maybe this dramatic story of her committing a whole host of awful sins. But she found herself maybe reaching out, trying to find that something that is missing because the world of selling and consuming just didn't quite add up. There had to be something more. And in a way, when we think about Lydia's life, we think about, or might see some connection to what Joyce Rupp calls the cup of our life. She suggests that we are always a cup or a vessel that can be filled or emptied at any point and at any level. And that cup is blessedly and exquisitely ordinary. It reminds us that personal transformation can occur in common things. The cup is a reminder of spiritual thirst and the inner process of growth. As we hold it, we fill it, we drink from it, empty it, and wash it, we learn. We learn that it is through the ordinary human experiences that our thirst for God is quenched, even in ways that surprise us when we're not looking. In the cup, we see life with its emptiness, fullness, brokenness, flaws, and blessings. The cup is a container of holding what God might fill in us too. And so whatever we hold, maybe whatever we are clinging onto, has to eventually be emptied out so that more might be poured in. We have this temptation in life, or at least I do, to expect our lives to always be full. And there is this pouring out, making room for something new that helps us understand the very poverty that gives us spiritually the capacity to respond to God at all. It's a constant process of emptying and filling, of giving, of receiving, of accepting, and of letting go. Henry Nouwen speaks of it in this way. You simply start by admitting that you can't cure yourself. You have to say yes fully to that powerlessness in order to let God actually heal you. It is a paradox of hospitality in ourselves that we are made a good host when we are actually empty and looking for even a little something. It is that inner disposition that maybe you know now in this moment that takes away our defenses and maybe converts people that might seem as enemies or strangers into generous friends. And we can only perceive ourselves that way and as others that way if we don't have something to defend. So Lydia's faith, as she was looking for something, and in Paul and his comrades, and found it, she becomes active and she becomes almost assertive in her seeking of God, and not taking it. She just remained available to exactly what was already there. She was baptized with her whole household. She opened her home. Cultural and social barriers crumble as she invited them into the halls of her home. And ultimately, the fellowship of the risen God was alive in her and in her space as she crossed the threshold, and as others she invited with her own power crossed the threshold as well to find saving and nourishment and new life. The radical acceptance and self-emptying for God to fill any of us starts with you. It starts with you and with me. I wonder, some of you may be following our devotional guide that we have put together for the series in these past 3 weeks. And the practice for this Sunday and for this particular story is an invitation to write a letter. So it's basically thinking about those people in your life like a Lydia or like a Paul that spoke into your life or invited because of the faith that they had and the joy that they knew that they wanted to share, and made for you every bit of difference. Maybe if you want to even try to practice it, maybe you'll feel led to write a letter of thanks to that person and just keep it to yourself as a gift of memory, remembering that none of us ever do this thing of faith alone. Or maybe you might feel led to send it to that person so that they can be blessed in knowing that they were a blessing, in knowing that they were a changed person who changed another person by the grace and power of God. We have a God, friends, that has no position to defend, no personal interest to protect, no competition in God's heart. God is free, and is our God that is free to serve. And so it all starts with you. How will you begin to do the good work and gracious work of emptying yourself, showing up, and making yourself available for all that God has in store for you today? In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.